Imagine standing on a black sand beach somewhere in the Pacific in 1944. The rain has been falling for hours. Your rifle is caked with mud. Your boots are sinking into the ground with every step. Somewhere beyond the trees, someone is trying to kill you. Hanging from your belt is the one tool you still trust. A 7-inch fighting knife with a leather handle worn smooth by sweat, salt water, and fear. Years later, when the war is over, you will carry that same knife home, place it in a drawer, and tell your son, "If there was one thing that never failed me, it was this." But here is the part almost nobody knows. The company whose name is stamped across that blade did not invent it. It did not produce the first one. It did not manufacture the most famous version of it. And for nearly 30 years, the knife that millions believed represented American craftsmanship wasn't even made by the people who had earned its reputation. How can a company lose the thing that made it famous while keeping the famous name? How can a brand survive after becoming separated from the craftsmen who built it? And perhaps the strangest question of all, what is actually more valuable? A factory, a product, or a single word? Because this is not really the story of a knife. It is the story of trust, of reputation, of a family that spent decades building something money couldn't buy, only to watch that priceless inheritance sold like any other asset on a balance sheet. It is also the story of a small American town that never stopped doing what it had always done, even after the world forgot who was really making the knives. To understand how one of the most respected names in military history almost disappeared, we have to travel back long before World War II, before Marines carried the knife into battle, before Hollywood turned it into a symbol of American toughness. We have to begin with something far less dramatic than war. A law passed by Congress. In 1897, when Washington raised tariffs on imported knives and razors, most Americans barely noticed. Politicians debated taxes. Newspapers argued about trade. But hundreds of miles away, in the hills of western New York and northwestern Pennsylvania, that single decision quietly changed history. For decades, American cutlers had struggled against cheaper and better-known blades arriving from Sheffield in England and Solingen in Germany. The finest knives in the world came from Europe. American manufacturers survived only by fighting for scraps of the market. Overnight, the tariff changed the rules. Imported knives became expensive. Suddenly, an ambitious craftsman with enough skill, enough patience, and enough courage could dream of building an American cutlery company that might actually survive. Across the region, dozens tried. Most disappeared without leaving a trace. Only a handful would become legends. And among those dreamers was a 19-year-old traveling salesman named Wallace R. Brown. He did not begin with a factory. He did not inherit a famous company. What he understood better than almost anyone else was something that still defines billion-dollar brands today. Steel can make a knife, but only trust can make people ask for it by name. Wallace Brown was about to spend the rest of his life proving that idea. He had no way of knowing that one day the name he built would become more valuable than the company itself, and that would almost destroy everything he had created. Step inside the factory on a cold winter morning in Olean, New York. Before you see anything, you hear it. A steel press slams down with a force so violent the vibration travels through the concrete floor and into your chest. Seconds later, it strikes again and again. The rhythm never stops. The air smells of machine oil, coal smoke, and hot steel fresh from the furnace. Sparks burst from grinding wheels like tiny fireworks, while rows of craftsmen lean over glowing blades, shaping them by hand until every edge feels exactly right. Long before automation could promise speed, quality depended on something far more difficult to build: experience. Every man on this factory floor knew steel differently. One could judge the temperature of a blade simply by its color. Another could hear from the sound of a hammer whether the metal had been hardened correctly. These weren't skills learned from manuals. They were passed from one generation to the next, father to son, master to apprentice, year after year. This was the world Wallace R. Brown wanted to build. Unlike many competitors, Brown understood that a knife was never just sharpened steel. Thousands of companies could forge blades. Very few could convince customers to ask for them by name. While others competed on price, Brown invested in reputation. Every hunting knife, every pocket knife, every razor that left his company carried the same invisible promise: if our name is on it, it will not fail you. That philosophy slowly transformed a small cutlery business into something much larger. In 1902, Brown brought several operations together under his control. By 1909, he renamed the company Union Cutlery, signaling that it had grown beyond selling razors alone. 2 years later, the city of Olean offered something American towns once competed fiercely to provide: land, tax incentives, and a purpose-built factory if Brown would move his business there. He accepted. It seemed like an ordinary business decision. In reality, it tied the future of one company to the future of an entire town. Families moved to Olean because the factory offered stable work. Local businesses grew around its employees. Children grew up expecting they might one day stand beside their fathers on the same production line. The factory wasn't simply producing knives anymore. It was producing livelihoods, traditions, and pride. But every great company eventually discovers that its greatest strength can also become its greatest weakness. Union Cutlery became famous for the craftsmanship hidden inside every blade, especially the stacked leather handle that felt warm in winter, secure in rain, and almost alive in the user's hand. Customers loved it. Hunters trusted it. Workers took pride in making it. Yet buried inside that beautiful design was a flaw nobody fully understood. Leather ages. Leather absorbs water. Leather can rot. Years later, on islands thousands of miles from Olean, young American servicemen would discover that weakness under the worst possible conditions. And by then, the company would already be known by a new name, a name born from a story so unbelievable that even today historians still argue over whether it actually happened. A wounded bear, a desperate hunter, and a letter containing just 2 unforgettable words would change the future of Union Cutlery forever. Around 1923, the company acquired the one asset that would eventually become worth more than every building, every machine, and every knife it ever produced. It acquired a word. According to the story repeated for generations, a fur trapper somewhere in Alaska wrote Union Cutlery after surviving an attack by a wounded bear. His rifle had jammed. With no other choice, he fought the animal using one of the company's knives. The letter that arrived was supposedly written so poorly that only 2 words could be understood: Kabar, a rough spelling of kill a bear. Wallace Brown loved the story so much that he adopted the phrase as the company's trademark. Whether that letter actually existed has never been proven. Historians still debate it today. Even the company itself has acknowledged that the evidence has been lost and has offered other explanations for the name over the years. But in business, legends often become more powerful than documents. Customers didn't buy the story because it could be verified. They bought it because it felt true. On January 8, 1924, the trademark K.A. Bar was officially registered. Looking back, It may have been the single most valuable decision in the company's history. Wallace Brown did not patent a revolutionary blade. He did not discover a new kind of steel. He secured ownership of an unforgettable name. Then, only months later, he was gone. Brown died at just 49 years old. He lived long enough to build the reputation, but not long enough to witness what that reputation would become. Leadership passed to his brother Emerson Brown, who also died unexpectedly a decade later. Responsibility then fell to Wallace's son, R. Danforth Brown. 3 generations, 3 leaders, one family carrying the weight of an increasingly famous company. Through the Great Depression, Union cutlery survived, while thousands of American manufacturers disappeared. Hunters still needed knives. Farmers still carried pocket knives. Craftsmen still depended on reliable tools. The company kept producing quality rather than chasing the cheapest possible price. It wasn't growing into a giant corporation. It was becoming something arguably more valuable, a trusted American name. And trust compounds. Every satisfied customer created another. Every father handed a knife to his son. Every recommendation strengthened the reputation that Wallace Brown had spent decades building. By the late 1930s, few people could have imagined how valuable that reputation would soon become, because halfway across the world, another conflict was already spreading. Europe was at war. Within a few years, the United States would be drawn into the largest military mobilization in its history. Millions of young Americans would need uniforms, rifles, helmets, boots, and eventually, a knife they could trust with their lives. Union Cutlery had spent 40 years convincing ordinary customers that its knives would never fail them. It was about to face the only customer whose standards were even higher than the American consumer, the United States Marine Corps. And that challenge would transform Kabar from a respected brand into an American legend. By the fall of 1942, the United States Marine Corps faced a problem that sounded almost insignificant compared to the global war raging around it. They needed a better knife, not a ceremonial knife polished for inspection, not a small pocket knife for camp chores. They needed a blade capable of digging fighting positions, cutting rope, opening ammunition crates, slicing through jungle vines, prying open ration cans, and, if everything else failed, keeping a Marine alive in hand-to-hand combat. The old World War I trench knife had become obsolete. The Navy's Mark I was considered too short and too light for the brutal conditions waiting in the Pacific. So the Marines did something remarkably rare. Instead of choosing an existing product, they sat down with experienced knife makers and designed an entirely new fighting and utility knife from the ground up. Every detail served a purpose. A 7-inch high-carbon steel blade offered enough reach without becoming cumbersome. The clip point could pierce as effectively as it could skin game. A thick steel guard protected the user's hand. 11 stacked leather washers compressed around the tang created a handle that remained comfortable even after hours of use. It wasn't designed to be the world's best fighting knife or the world's best survival knife. It was designed to be both. Military paperwork gave it a forgettable designation, the 1219 C2 Fighting Utility Knife. History would remember it by a completely different name. But before that happened, another surprise entered the story. When production contracts were awarded in late 1942, the Marine Corps didn't trust any single manufacturer to build enough knives quickly. The work was divided among several American companies. On January 27, 1943, the very first shipment rolled off the production line, not from Union Cutlery in Olean, but from Camillus Cutlery in central New York. Over the course of the war, Camillus would manufacture more than 1 million of these knives, making it the largest producer by far. Union Cutlery, despite becoming forever associated with the design, actually produced fewer. If history rewarded factories based only on production numbers, the knife should probably be remembered as the Camillus fighting knife. It wasn't. Because factories don't choose language. The people carrying the knives do. Unlike many manufacturers that stamped long company names across their blades, Union Cutlery used something much shorter. 4 letters. KADACA. It was easy to recognize, easy to pronounce, easy to remember under stress. Marines began referring to every knife of that pattern as a K-bar, even when it had been manufactured by someone else. Recruits heard instructors use the word during training. Veterans repeated it in the field. The nickname spread through barracks, beaches, and battlefields until it completely replaced the official military designation. Within a remarkably short time, the 1219 C2 no longer existed in everyday conversation. It had become simply the K-bar. This is one of the rarest achievements any brand has ever accomplished. It stopped being the name of a product and became the name of an entire category. People didn't ask whether a Marine carried a fighting utility knife. They asked whether he carried a Ka-bar. The company had unknowingly achieved every marketer's impossible dream, but there was a hidden danger buried inside that extraordinary success. The more people separated the word K-bar from the company that owned it, the easier it became for someone else to profit from the name, without preserving everything that had made the name worth trusting in the first place. That danger wouldn't appear during the war. It would arrive only after victory, when the gunfire stopped and the businessmen arrived. When World War II ended, millions of American servicemen returned home carrying more than memories. Many carried a K-bar, some kept it in a toolbox, others hung it above the fireplace. Fathers handed it to sons, grandfathers passed it to grandsons. The knife had earned something that no advertising campaign, no celebrity endorsement, and no marketing budget could ever purchase. It had earned trust under the one condition where trust matters most: the belief that your life might depend on it. That reputation should have secured the company's future for generations. Instead, it became the beginning of its greatest crisis. In 1960, R. Danforth Brown died unexpectedly, ending more than 6 decades of Brown family leadership. Without a successor ready to continue the business, the family sold the company. What happened next has been repeated throughout American manufacturing history more times than most people realize. The factories, the machinery, the trademark, and decades of goodwill became assets on a balance sheet. Different owners saw different opportunities, but very few saw what Wallace Brown had spent his lifetime building. Eventually, the Ka-bar trademark was acquired by a corporate owner, with no connection to Olean, no tradition of knife-making, and no emotional investment in the craftsmen whose hands had built the brand. The famous name remained. The manufacturing did not. Imported knives carrying the Ka-bar logo began appearing in hardware stores across America. On paper, the strategy made perfect business sense. Overseas production reduced costs. Retail margins increased. The brand recognition remained strong enough to sell products at scale. Every spreadsheet looked healthier. But spreadsheets cannot measure disappointment. Somewhere during those years, a Marine who had trusted a K-bar through the Pacific walked into a store hoping to buy one for his son. He picked it up, felt the balance, examined the finish, and immediately realized something had changed. The logo was familiar. The knife was not. In that quiet moment, the company lost something no financial statement could record. A generation stopped recommending the brand with the same confidence it once had. Reputation had been separated from craftsmanship. The word survived. The people who gave the word its meaning were left behind. Yet the story did not end there. While ownership changed hands and the trademark traveled from one corporation to another, the craftsmen in Olean never forgot how to build knives. The presses continued to operate. Steel continued to be heat-treated. Leather continued to be stacked onto tangs exactly as it had been for decades. They had lost the name, but they had never lost the skill. Then, in 1996, something remarkable happened. The Kabar brand returned to Olean after nearly 30 years away when it was acquired by Alcus, the family-owned parent company of Cutco. For the first time in decades, the name on the blade once again belonged to the people who understood what that name actually meant. Today, genuine Kabar knives are still manufactured in Olean, New York. The company continues to face new challenges, from global competition and counterfeit products to changing supply chains, but the lesson of its history reaches far beyond the knife industry. Wallace Brown believed that steel could build a knife, but only trust could build a brand. More than a century later, that idea remains true. Because factories can be sold, machines can be replaced, even famous trademarks can change owners. But reputation only belongs to the people who earn it. So, think back to that rain-soaked beach in the Pacific, where this story began. Imagine a young Marine tightening his grip around a worn leather handle before stepping into the unknown. The blade in his hand became legendary, not because it was perfect, nor because it was produced in the greatest numbers, but because, when everything else failed, it did exactly what it had promised to do. In the end, that was never really the story of a knife. It was the story of a promise. And after losing that promise for nearly 30 years, the people who forged it finally brought it home.